The Pemberton estate stood at the edge of Hawthorne Ridge like a brooding sentinel, its towers clawing at the muted sky as if trying to escape something buried deep within its foundations. For decades, the villagers whispered about the house, how every family member who lived there either disappeared, went mad, or died in ways that left more questions than answers. Yet despite its grim reputation, the house was never abandoned. Dim candlelight was often seen flickering in its upper windows, even though no one had lived there for years. Some claimed the light was a trick of the fog. Others insisted it was the Pembertons themselves, refusing to leave even in death. The night the forbidden room revealed itself began like any other in Hawthorne Ridge, quiet, smothered beneath a thick shroud of fog, but the storm that rolled in carried a strange weight, as though the sky itself was bracing for something long buried to rise again. Lightning crawled across the clouds in jagged veins, illuminating the Pemberton estate in brief, violent flashes. The villagers watched from their shuttered windows, the way one watches a wounded animal in its final, desperate moments, because storms had always behaved strangely around that house. They circled it, lingered above it, snarled at its walls as if challenging whatever slept inside. That night, the challenge was answered. The first roar of thunder rattled the ground like an ancient lock snapping open. The wind surged up the hill, slamming into the estate with enough force to shake its rotted shutters and pry at the brittle window panes. The house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that rolled through its hallways like an awakening breath. For years, the upper wing had been sealed, boards nailed across door frames, furniture piled against entryways, dust thick enough to muffle footsteps. Every Pemberton heir had been warned never to go near that part of the estate, though none of them could explain why. The warnings had outlived their keepers, repeated only in fragments, *, the wing is dangerous, that room must stay shut, the walls remember too much. *. When the lightning struck the northwest tower, it didn't merely crack stone or scorch wood. It sliced straight through the structure, sending a tremor so fierce that the old beams groaned under the sudden shift. A second strike followed almost instantly, as if drawn to the house rather than repelled by it. The impact split a section of the roof, and part of the barricaded upper wall tore away, exposing the hallway beyond. Dust spilled like ash into the storm. For a moment, there was only darkness, thick and lifeless. Then, very slowly, something inside began to stir. The door at the far end of the corridor, locked for generations, trembled on its hinges. The old brass handle rattled as if turned by an unseen hand, though no living Pemberton remained to open it. The boards nailed across its surface shifted. One loosened. Another creaked free and dropped to the floor, the sound swallowed by thunder. On the third lightning strike, the lock, rusted, ancient, stubborn, snapped with a brittle metallic crack. The door eased open a fraction, exhaling a gust of air so cold it crystallized against the hallway's shattered window. Inside, the room waited as though it had expected this moment. The lantern belonging to the last caretaker still hung beside the ruined doorway, its glass fogged but intact. When the storm wind swept through the hall, the lantern flickered to life, an impossibility yet unmistakably real. A thin, quivering flame burned within it, casting an amber glow across the threshold. Slowly, the door pushed open wider, revealing a space that had no right to exist in a family home. The walls were etched with deep claw marks, some long, dragging furrows like someone had raked metal across the plaster, others desperate, smaller, frantic, as if fingernails had been torn away in the attempt to scratch words or warnings that were never completed. Strange sigils, carved in deliberate patterns, filled the spaces between the gouges. Some glowed faintly under the lantern's light, their colors shifting like embers breathing. The markings looked too old to decipher, yet too deliberate to dismiss as mere superstition. They were symbols of binding, of imprisonment, of something kept behind walls not to hide it from the world, but to protect the world from it. Dust coated the room in thick layers, except for a single narrow path leading from the doorway to the far wall, as though something had paced there over and over again, wearing the floor bare. At the end of that path stood a wooden chair facing the corner, its legs chained to iron rings embedded in the floor. The restraints were snapped, twisted outward in a way that suggested they hadn't been cut or unlocked, but ripped apart with tremendous force. Above the chair, the plaster bulged outward, cracked in a pattern resembling a massive hand pressing from the inside. It looked disturbingly fresh. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling through the broken wall panels like a chorus of distant voices. The house trembled again, but this time it felt less like a reaction to the storm and more like a pulse, steady, rhythmic, alive. The villagers who watched from below would later swear the tower briefly lit from within, as though someone had walked through the newly exposed hallway holding a lantern. Some claimed they heard a low, dragging sound echoing down the hillside, as if furniture, or chains, were being pulled across a wooden floor. Others insisted they saw the silhouette of a tall, gaunt figure standing in the blown-out portion of the upper wing, unmoving, watching the valley with an unnatural stillness. Whatever had been sealed in that forbidden room had endured decades in darkness, pacing its narrow path, circling its chains, tracing its sigils in the walls like a beast with no voice left to scream. And now, with the seal broken and the storm tearing open the last barrier between it and the rest of the house, it stepped out into the corridor for the first time in generations, carrying with it the cold weight of everything the Pembertons had tried so desperately to bury. The portrait had always been an unsettling thing, even before the changes began. It hung in the grand hall where the Pembertons once hosted their rare gatherings, dusty, dim events that felt more like rituals than celebrations. The villagers who had entered the estate in its final years remembered the painting vividly, though none could say why it stayed etched in their minds long after they left. Perhaps it was the expression on the family members' faces, expressions too strained to be natural, too hollow to be affectionate, as if each of them had been told to smile while someone whispered a threat just out of frame. Or perhaps it was the background behind them, painted too darkly, almost pitch black, giving the impression that the Pemberton family had been posed not in their manner but in front of some vast, open void. For years, the portrait stood untouched, preserved out of respect, tradition, or fear. No one dared remove it. No one dared suggest it should be destroyed. When the forbidden room opened, something in the house seemed to shift, subtle at first, like a breath drawn in silence. The next morning, the caretaker who had reluctantly taken on the task of inspecting the storm damage noticed something odd. The faces in the painting looked different. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. The eldest daughter's gaze seemed more focused, directed slightly to the left instead of straight ahead. The youngest son's mouth curved almost imperceptibly downward, a shade more somber than before. Convinced his memory was betraying him, he dismissed it, blaming the flickering light, the shadows, or perhaps the unsettling atmosphere of the house itself. Houses like these played tricks on the mind, especially one carrying so much history, grief, and rumor. But the changes did not stop. On the second day, the caretaker returned to the hall and felt an unfamiliar pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled on his shoulders like a hand. He didn't notice the portrait immediately, not until the light shifted, revealing something that stole his breath. The grandmother, who had once been painted with a faint smile, now looked stern, disapproving, her eyes cold and alert. And behind her, barely visible in the shadowed background, was the shape of a man. Not clearly defined, just a faint silhouette, too translucent to be part of the original painting. The caretaker's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stepped back, staring, trying to remember if something had always been lurking in the dark backdrop. He couldn't recall. He didn't want to. But memory felt unreliable in that house, as if the walls had begun rewriting the past in small, deliberate ways. By the third day, the portrait had become impossible to ignore. The villagers who came to help repair the damaged roof were invited inside to warm themselves. One of them, a woman known for her sharp eye and blunt honesty, froze at the sight of the painting. She pointed, her face draining of color. There was now a man clearly visible in the background, no longer a faint silhouette, but a figure with defined shoulders, a long coat, and a face partially turned toward the family. His features were indistinct, blurred as though smeared by an invisible hand, but his posture suggested movement. He was stepping forward. Toward the family. Toward the viewer. The caretaker tried to laugh it off, blaming humidity, damage from the storm, or the strange varnish used by old painters. But the villagers did not laugh. They left quickly, muttering prayers under their breath as they crossed the threshold. By nightfall, word had spread through Hawthorne Ridge that something inside the Pemberton estate was stirring, and that the portrait had begun to expose secrets better left unknown. That night, the caretaker found himself unable to sleep. The house's creaks felt purposeful, its shadows too thick, its silence too absolute. At midnight, driven by a mixture of dread and fascination, he returned to the grand hall. The portrait was waiting in the darkness, illuminated faintly by moonlight leaking through cracked windows. He approached it slowly, each step echoing through the cavernous hallway. His throat tightened when he saw the next change. The family's expressions were no longer merely altered, they were terrified. The mother's eyes were wide, staring not at the viewer but at something behind her. The father's hand, once resting calmly on the back of his son's chair, now gripped it with such force that the painted knuckles looked white. The children's postures had shifted, the youngest daughter leaned away from the encroaching shadow, her small hands clenched. And the man in the background was much closer. His face had sharpened into something that might once have been human, but the eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, like the darkness in the forbidden room had seeped into the canvas. The caretaker stumbled back, bumping into a side table, knocking over a candlestick. The moment the metal clattered against the floor, the house seemed to inhale sharply, as if disturbed. He scrambled toward the hall entrance, desperate to flee, but a whisper, soft, hoarse, unmistakably real, dragged his attention back toward the portrait. It wasn't a voice he recognized, it was older, brittle with time, and layered with something like hunger. It murmured just one word, but it sent a cold shiver down his spine so violently that his legs nearly gave out. When he looked again, the figure in the background had reached the very edge of the family. One hand extended toward the father's shoulder, fingers long, too long, curling like they were reaching out of the canvas itself. The caretaker fled the hall, leaving the room in total darkness, but he knew the portrait wasn't done changing. And worse, he knew the next time he saw it, the figure wouldn't be in the background anymore. The journal of the missing Pemberton heir was discovered in a place no one expected, wedged behind a loose stone near the hearth in the study, as if someone had hidden it in a frantic rush. Its leather cover was warped with age, and the pages were stained with watermarks, ink smudges, and something darker, something that resembled soot or ash. The caretaker found it during his attempt to catalogue the house's contents, telling himself he was simply doing his duty, though deep down he suspected the house allowed the journal to be found. Nothing inside the estate appeared by chance. Not anymore. With trembling hands, he opened it, expecting dull family records or accounts of daily life. What he found instead was the final testimony of a man who had been slowly unraveling within these walls, a man who knew what the rest of the world refused to acknowledge. The entries began innocently enough. The heir, Elias Pemberton, had returned to the estate after years abroad, drawn not by affection but obligation. He described the house as suffocating but familiar, a place where silence felt alive and the shadows lingered too long in the corners. He mentioned the strained expressions of his relatives, their constant glances over their shoulders, their hushed conversations when they believed he wasn't listening. He noted the way servants refused to enter the West Wing after sunset and the way the dogs howled for hours whenever thunder approached. At first, Elias believed these behaviors were the result of old superstitions and frayed nerves. But as he continued writing, his tone shifted from detached observation to uneasy acknowledgement. Days later, the entries grew short and urgent, filled with observations that defied reason. He wrote about footsteps inside the locked room, pacing steadily, rhythmically, as though measuring the length of its prison. He recorded nights when whispers kept him awake, the kind that slithered through cracks in the door and brushed against his ears like icy breath. He wrote of waking to find his bedroom door open, though he remembered locking it, and of seeing the candles extinguish themselves the moment he tried to explore the forbidden part of the house. The most unsettling part was the gradual change in Elias's handwriting. His neat, controlled script became jagged, rushed, as if his hand trembled with every word he etched into the page. The journal documented a key moment, the night Elias first heard the house speak. He described lying in bed as the storm battered the windows. The estate moaned and shuddered, not from wind or rain but from something inside the walls shifting. He heard a deep, resonant voice, more vibration than sound, murmur his name. He froze, breath locked in his throat. The voice came again, this time closer, as though it seeped through the wood and crept along the floorboards until it reached the foot of his bed. *Come back*, it whispered. *. You belong here. Elias fled his room, leaving behind his candle. He didn't return until sunrise. From that night forward, the entries became increasingly desperate. Elias wrote that the house was awakening, that it had grown aware of him in ways that made him feel watched, studied, claimed. He described dreams that felt more like memories, visions of a figure chained to a chair, clawing at walls, screaming without sound. He wrote of the family portrait that seemed to change each time he passed it, though he tried to convince himself it was only exhaustion twisting his perception. He mentioned cold spots that followed him like invisible shadows, pockets of air so frigid they numbed his skin instantly. He wrote that the estate exhaled when he walked through it, that its walls pulsed faintly as though breathing. One entry stood out more than the rest, scrawled across an entire page in frantic strokes. Elias stated that he had finally learned the truth. He didn't explain how, only that the Pembertons had not been victims of the house but its caretakers, bound by a pact older than the estate itself. Each generation had been responsible for keeping something restrained, something bound in the forbidden room, and failure to uphold the pact meant unleashing a force that fed on the mind, the spirit, the very soul. Elias wrote that the chains were weakening, the sigils losing power, and that he alone knew how close the entity was to breaking free completely. His final coherent paragraph claimed he had attempted to speak with his family about the danger, but they dismissed him with hollow assurances. They already knew. They had always known. The last few pages were nearly illegible, filled with erratic writing, ink spills, and fragmented sentences. Elias wrote that the house wanted him, that it whispered his childhood name in the darkness, that the footsteps outside his door were no longer confined to the forbidden room. He heard knocking inside the walls, clawing beneath the floorboards, something scraping under his bed. He begged for escape, for the courage to leave, yet admitted he felt an invisible tether pulling him back every time he approached the gates. The estate did not allow its chosen heir to abandon it. The journal ended abruptly. The final line was half-written, the ink trailing off the page as though Elias had been pulled away mid-sentence. It read, "The house has awakened, and it knows I, " There were no more words, no more pages. Elias Pemberton was never seen again. Only the journal remained, a record of his unraveling mind or a warning left too late for anyone to heed. The first time the echoing footsteps were heard, the caretaker blamed his imagination. It was well past midnight, the storm clouds had only just begun to drift away, and the Pemberton estate was wrapped in a suffocating kind of darkness, the kind that made even the bravest feel small and unwelcome. He had been walking down the second-floor corridor, lantern in hand, when he heard it, a single, deliberate step at the far end of the hall. He froze, the flame flickering weakly in the glass. The house was old, it creaked, it groaned, it settled. But this sound was different. It was purposeful, heavy, and unmistakably human. He waited, breath held tight in his chest, but nothing followed. After a few minutes, he forced himself to continue, convincing his mind that fatigue was turning common sounds into threats. But deep inside, something cold twisted, telling him this was not the house shifting. This was someone, or something, walking. He did not hear the footsteps again until the next night. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of roofers staying overnight had been sleeping in the drawing room, too exhausted to travel back to town. They were practical men, unshakable, not easily rattled by ghost stories or local superstitions. When the clock on the mantel struck 3:03 a.m., all of them stirred at once. They did not speak, they simply lifted their heads, listening. The caretaker felt the tension in the air thicken as the footsteps began again, slow, heavy, pacing back and forth outside the drawing room door. The wood beneath them creaked under the weight, the rhythm steady, unhurried, as if the walker had all the time in the world. One of the men whispered a curse, clutching his blanket. Another insisted it must be the wind, though the caretaker noticed how his hands shook as he said it. When the footsteps abruptly stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. By morning, the roofers packed their belongings and left without waiting for their payment. They muttered excuses about needing to return to their families, but the fear in their eyes betrayed them. None of them looked back as they hurried down the gravel path. Their hasty departure left the caretaker alone in the house with the sound he could no longer deny. That afternoon, he walked the corridor where the footsteps had echoed, counting each floorboard, checking every inch for loose planks or signs of an animal. He found nothing but cold patches on the wood, as if something had stood there for hours without moving. The temperature felt unnatural, a deep chill that made his breath fog despite the warmth of the day. The footsteps returned every night afterward, always at the same time. 3:03 a.m. Not a minute earlier or later. They began softly, like someone waking from a long sleep. A single step. A pause. Then another, each one more grounded than the last. The caretaker started keeping watch, hiding behind doorways with his lantern off, listening as the steps passed inches from where he stood. Sometimes they were slow and dragging, like the walker was exhausted. Other times they were swift, agitated, as though searching for something, or someone. They traveled the entire length of the upper corridor, stopped outside bedrooms, loitered near staircases, even reached the locked door of the forbidden room before turning back. What terrified him most was that faint impressions began appearing on the dusty floorboards, shallow, misshapen footprints, too elongated to belong to any person and angled strangely, as if whatever walked there had joints that didn't move like a human's. Eventually, word of the footsteps spread. A few curious townspeople offered to spend a night in the estate, expecting a good story to share later at the tavern. They arrived laughing, confident, armed with lanterns and a flask of courage. But their bravado crumbled once the hour approached. The house seemed to anticipate their presence, the air becoming still and thick, as though sealing all exits. When the clock chimed 3:03, every lantern flickered. The sound began again, slow, heavy, deliberate. The guests huddled together, watching the door as the footsteps approached. One woman swore she saw the outline of a shadow beneath the gap in the door frame, as though someone stood outside, waiting. A man claimed he heard breathing, low and ragged. Another said he felt the doorknob twitch under an unseen hand. None of them stayed a second night. The caretaker tried to rationalize the pattern, but there was none. The footsteps did not follow the living. They did not mimic anyone within the house. They seemed tied to the house itself, to its pulse, to whatever had been unleashed from the forbidden room. The pacing grew more frantic with each passing night, as though the unseen walker grew impatient. Sometimes, the sound would shift, no longer footsteps but dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Other nights, it sounded like nails scraping wood. The worst nights were when the footsteps stopped directly outside the caretaker's door, followed by a long silence in which the only thing he could hear was his own heartbeat. He never dared open the door to check. He feared what he might see, or what might see him. The villagers began refusing to approach the estate at night. Even from the road, they claimed they could hear the pacing through the broken upper windows, echoing down the hillside. They said the sound followed travelers long after they passed the house, as though something walked behind them, unseen, mimicking their steps. Some insisted they had been awakened at exactly 3:03 a.m. even in their own homes miles away, hearing faint footsteps outside their bedroom doors, fading only when dawn crept in. The caretaker eventually realized something horrifying: the footsteps were not random hauntings or echoes of the past. They were searching. They had been searching from the moment the forbidden room opened. And each night, the steps grew a little closer, a little louder, a little more purposeful, as if the entity wandering the halls was becoming stronger, more aware, and increasingly eager to find the one thing it believed it had been promised. The ledger was bound in black leather so worn it felt soft as cloth, its corners frayed, its spine cracked from generations of handling. It was discovered only after the caretaker followed a faint draft inside the study, noticing a sliver of air slipping through a seam in the wall. Curious and too far past the point of ignoring strange occurrences, he pressed against the panel, and it swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow cavity lined with wooden shelves. Most were empty, coated in thick layers of neglect, but one shelf at the very back held the ledger, centered perfectly, as though someone had placed it there deliberately, expecting it to be found when the time was right. Dust coated its surface, but the moment the caretaker touched it, a pulse of cold radiated through his fingers, as if something inside the book had awakened at his touch. He opened it slowly, half expecting the pages to crumble. Instead, they turned smoothly, their edges yellowed but strong. The writing inside was meticulous, each entry dated, organized, and signed by a different generation of Pemberton heirs. What began as nothing more than a family record grew darker with each passing decade. Early entries talked of land purchases, births, marriages, ordinary matters belonging to an old lineage. But buried deeper in the book's heart, the tone changed. Words grew terse, calculated. The ink strokes appeared heavier, pressed harder into the paper. One entry, dated more than 2 centuries earlier, contained the first mention of the pact, written without explanation, as though the writer assumed future heirs would already know its meaning. The caretaker read on, feeling dread settle in his stomach like a lead weight. The truth revealed itself slowly, deliberately, as if the ledger were savoring the moment it would no longer be a secret. The Pemberton family had not merely inherited the estate, they had inherited a duty. A debt. A curse. According to the oldest entries, the land on which the manor was built had once belonged to a solitary figure known only in whispers, a man shunned by the surrounding villages for reasons the book never fully explained. Some called him a recluse, others a sorcerer, others something far older, something that predated the villages themselves. What was certain, according to the text, was that he possessed knowledge no human should wield. When he died, or vanished, depending on whose account was written, his influence seeped into the land, refusing to fade. The Pembertons had been the first to settle there after his disappearance. They prospered quickly, suspiciously so, their fortune expanding in ways no ordinary family could achieve in so short a time. A later entry, written in shaky handwriting, admitted that the prosperity came at a cost. The pact was struck between the land's original inhabitant and the first Pemberton patriarch. In exchange for wealth, protection, and social rise, the family would ensure that the entity bound within the land, whatever it was, would never be left alone. The estate was to be occupied, its halls walked, its rooms filled with voices and breath. The presence of the living served as a barrier, a distraction, a way to keep the entity contained. The house must never be empty, one entry read, underlined 3 times. Another emphasized, it grows hungry when left to its own silence. The later generations described how the entity manifested itself, first as cold drafts, then as whispers, then as shifting shadows. The forbidden room was constructed as its prison, reinforced with symbols taught to the family by a traveler whose name was deliberately blotted out in ink so dark it ate through the paper. Iron rings were set into the floor. Chains blessed by an unknown ritual were fastened to hold a presence that had no fixed shape. Each heir was required to check the room at specific intervals, reciting words none of them understood, their voices trembling as they repeated syllables that felt wrong in their mouths. The ledger revealed page after page of attempts to reinforce the bindings, but each generation admitted the same terrifying truth: the entity was patient. Its strength grew whenever fear did. And fear was the one emotion the house conjured effortlessly. Some entries hinted at failures, small ones at first. A Pemberton child who wandered too close to the forbidden room and came away unable to speak. A servant who vanished, leaving behind only fingernail scratches on the doorframe. A family dinner interrupted by every candle extinguishing at once, plunging the room into darkness filled with a single, long exhale that did not come from any person sitting at the table. The entries grew increasingly desperate. The last heir who wrote in the ledger before Elias mentioned that the sigils were weakening, the chains rusting, and the entity growing restless. He wrote that the family portrait began changing only after the forbidden room's original seal was damaged, suggesting the entity's influence had seeped through the house's very walls, reaching toward the living in subtle ways. The final entry was the shortest, dated only days before Elias returned to the estate. It read, "We have failed. It is waking. If you are reading this, bind it again, or flee before you become its keeper." The writing trailed off as if the writer had been pulled away abruptly. The caretaker closed the ledger slowly, his hands trembling. Every unexplained sound, every cold patch, every whispered voice suddenly made a dreadful kind of sense. The footsteps at 3:03 a.m., the changing portrait, the journal entries, the storm that tore open the forbidden room, all of it pointed to one inescapable truth: the entity the Pembertons had bound for generations had finally slipped free of its restraints. The house that had always required the presence of the living was no longer content with being merely occupied. It was hungry. And now that the pact had been broken, it would not stop until it claimed every soul that dared step inside its walls.